The rain had begun in the small hours, a quiet, persistent drizzle that settled over the city like a damp sigh. I walked along the cobbled streets of Oxford, my coat collar raised against the chill, noticing how the lamplight caught in the puddles, flickering against the wet stone like tentative signals from some other world. There was a faint, melancholy beauty in the empty streets, the air heavy with the scent of damp paper, and the faint tang of the river that threaded its way through the city. Even the sound of my footsteps seemed measured, almost reverent, in the hush of morning before the first tram rattled over the iron tracks. I passed the gates of All Souls College and paused, my gaze drawn to the library windows where the lamplight inside made a muted glow on the rain-streaked panes. There was an oddness to the quiet, a subtle unease that suggested something beneath the routine calm. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to linger too long along the stone balustrades, or the faint odor of something burned paper, wax, perhaps a candle smoldering unattended. I made a note of it, though it seemed inconsequential at the time, just a detail among many in a city that thrived on minutiae. As I walked through the Fellows' Quad, I overheard fragments of conversation drifting from the cloistered walkways. Two dons, speaking in measured tones about an upcoming lecture, hinted at disagreement, though their words were chosen to betray nothing. One phrase lingered about a matter of principle and a disagreement that should have remained private. I caught the subtle tension, a hesitation in the pitch of the younger fellow's voice that suggested a grievance, unspoken, yet insistent. I filed it away, as I do with all fleeting observations, knowing that sometimes the most delicate cues point to truths larger than any shouted confession. A small notice on the gatepost drew my attention, a printed sheet about the college's annual endowment lecture. The typeface was unremarkable, but the way it had been tacked slightly askew, dampened at the edges by the rain, gave it a curious visual emphasis, almost as if the notice itself were reluctant to be read. It was trivial, perhaps, but my mind is attuned to such trivialities, knowing that the world often hides secrets in its most ordinary objects. I passed under the cloister arches, noting the patterns of rain tracing lines across the flagstones, and wondered what might have transpired in the solitude of the fellows' rooms while the city slept. A young scholar emerged from the library, carrying a small bundle of manuscripts, his expression distracted. He did not notice my gaze lingering, yet there was something in the careful way he held the papers, as if guarding them from the damp, that seemed disproportionate to their weight. I made another mental note. By the time I reached the corner of Radcliffe Square, the rain had intensified, a soft percussion on my umbrella. The bells of the university, church tolled in the distance, their melancholy resonance carried by the moist air. I allowed myself a moment to observe, to breathe in the city before it awoke fully, and I knew then, though I could not have articulated it, that the day would not pass without shadows touching these streets, that beneath the lamplight of All Souls, some secret waited to emerge. It was not until the second day of mist and drizzle that the first real concern reached me. Edmund Vance, a junior fellow at All Souls, had not appeared for his scheduled lectures, nor had he been seen in the usual haunts of the college. The notice came indirectly, filtered through a corridor of gossip that moves faster than the rain along the stone streets. A porter mentioned it almost casually, as if the absence were a minor inconvenience rather than a potential alarm. Yet I felt the subtle disquiet that accompanies the disappearance of one so young, so visible in his quiet diligence. I walked the familiar route to the Fellows' dining hall, observing the reactions of those who knew him. Faces that usually carried the calm dignity of habit now flickered with concern or guarded indifference, a small tremor in the otherwise immobile poise of academic life. A senior don remarked, almost under his breath, that Vance had been troubled by the debates over the new manuscript acquisition, hinting that scholarly rivalry sometimes breeds strange, disproportionate anxieties. There was no accusation, only the faintest tremor in tone, a hesitation that suggested more than it stated. Among the students, whispers were less precise but more revealing. They spoke of Vance's peculiar insistence on checking minor details in his work, correcting quotations of obscure poets, and the occasional heated disagreement with a visiting scholar. I noticed, in the glances exchanged, the subtle tension between affection for the young fellow and a relief that his absence might delay certain scholarly obligations. It is in these unscripted gestures, the flicker of an eye, a tilt of the head, that one begins to sense the hidden narrative. I entered the library, where the air was thick with the must of old paper, damp from the persistent rain. Shelves leaned slightly, as though burdened with centuries of unspoken truths. I noted the absence of Vance's usual place at the oak table near the window, where he habitually cross-checked citations and scribbled notes on scraps of paper. The chair was empty, the ink-stained blotter untouched, yet a single bookmark protruded from a volume of Milton, placed carefully as if he might return momentarily. An overlooked gesture, but in its precision, it seemed to speak of deliberation rather than accident. A minor curiosity caught my attention. A half-solved crossword left on the library table, in the same handwriting, with the clue pastoral aligning with the letters Vance. I paused, considering the coincidence, though I knew it was trivial. Still, it suggested a mind attuned to order and pattern, a pattern that might yet explain his absence if read carefully. I filed it mentally, a small beacon of logic among the gentle chaos of speculation. By mid-afternoon, the absence was more than noticeable. The fellows moved with a subtle wariness, arranging conversations to mask concern or elicit details from one another without seeming intrusive. I spoke briefly with a librarian, who recalled Vance muttering about a matter requiring solitude, an evasive phrase that, though vague, hinted at internal preoccupations rather than external threat. Yet even this elusiveness carried weight. The careful choice of words, the slight pause before each utterance, suggested that the young fellow's disappearance was neither idle nor accidental. Leaving the library, I felt the rain soaking into my coat, a cold reminder of the day's quiet tension. Oxford persisted around me, indifferent yet intimate, its lamplights reflecting in the puddles as if each contained a fragment of the unfolding mystery. Something lay hidden in the folds of ordinary days, in the absent figure of a diligent scholar, and I could sense, without knowing precisely, that this small absence would unravel further, revealing complexities beneath the calm, stone-bound surface of All Souls. I remember entering the library that morning with a quiet sense of anticipation, the air heavy with the must of old paper and the subtle dampness that had settled over Oxford like a persistent thought. The rain continued its soft percussion against the tall windows, and the lamplight cast elongated shadows across the oak shelves, revealing the library in fragments, a place both intimate and unknowable. It was in this dim, hushed expanse that I first noticed the small folded note tucked between the volumes of classical poetry, a detail that might have escaped anyone less attentive. The note was modest, no larger than a postcard, its paper slightly damp at the edges, the ink smudged in places as though it had been hastily hidden or retrieved in haste. The handwriting was deliberate, refined even, yet carried a nervous tremor in its faintest curves, suggesting its author had been unsettled. I unfolded it carefully, aware that something about the simplicity of the words might conceal a larger significance. The message was cryptic, fragmentary, a few lines that hinted at grievance, perhaps jealousy, perhaps a disappointment long held, yet articulated in a manner that seemed almost poetic. I reread it twice, as one might study a marginal note in a manuscript, seeking the weight behind the phrasing. Nearby, a young scholar moved among the stacks, carrying a bundle of manuscripts with an air of distraction. I noticed, in the briefest of gestures, the way he adjusted the bundle, pressing it to his chest as though guarding it from intrusion, and the slight hesitation with which he glanced over his shoulder. A minor detail, almost imperceptible, yet it lingered in the mind, suggesting that, These documents, and perhaps the note itself, were not merely incidental. I filed it away mentally, along with the observation that he had absent-mindedly left a single pencil on the table, its tip broken and yet perfectly aligned with the edge of a blank page. The care of such gestures often betrays more than words can convey. The library itself seemed to participate in the mystery. The smell of ink and old leather mingled with the damp chill, and the floorboards creaked softly as I moved among the shelves. Each whisper of sound felt amplified in the stillness, each shadow a potential hiding place for secrets. I noted a marginalia in a volume of Milton, a line underlined with faintly trembling script, its placement eerily similar to the note I had found. It was the sort of detail one might dismiss. Yet in my experience, these overlooked fragments often flicker into significance in ways that the unobservant cannot anticipate. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, seated at the usual oak table near the window, watching the rain distort the shapes of the cloisters outside. The note remained before me, a quiet puzzle, and I thought of Vance, absent and unseen, and of the network of rivalries and unspoken tensions that threaded through the college. A sense of anticipation mingled with unease, for it was rarely the bold confession that revealed the truth, but the small, careful gestures, the fragments of language, the misplaced bookmark or pencil, the subtle deviations from habit. Rising to leave, I tucked the note safely into my coat pocket, aware that it was both a clue and a challenge, its meaning obscured by context, yet illuminated by the slightest observation. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the stone walkways into mirrors for the flickering lamplights, and I felt, as I often do in Oxford, that beneath the everyday rhythms lay currents of tension and secrecy, waiting for a mind willing to notice the smallest irregularities. The dinner that evening was formal in appearance but strained beneath the veneer of civility. The fellows gathered in the high-ceilinged hall, the long oak table polished to a muted gleam, candles flickering against the dark panels, and the rain continuing its relentless percussion on the windows beyond. I took my place at the side, observing rather than participating, noting the subtle choreography of gestures, the polite inflections, the carefully measured tones that concealed far more than they revealed. There was an unease in the air, a tension that moved like a low current beneath the ritual of cutlery and wine. Vance's absence was felt not in open lamentation, but in the quiet gaps of conversation. A visiting don spoke of a recent manuscript, his enthusiasm slightly clipped, while another fellow countered with restrained sarcasm about a matter of academic priority, their eyes flicking ever so briefly toward the empty chair that had been Vance's. These were small gestures, almost imperceptible, yet they spoke to rivalries, to unspoken grievances, to the friction of pride that is so common in places devoted to intellect. I noted the slight stiffening of shoulders when certain topics arose and the way some words were delivered a beat too quickly, as though rehearsed. I watched the young scholar from the library, the one with the careful hold on his bundle of manuscripts, now seated across from a senior fellow whose gaze lingered longer than courtesy demanded. The scholar's hand trembled just enough as he reached for his glass, and the subtle shift in his posture betrayed more than he intended. I made a mental note, for it was often in these understated movements that truth first surfaced, like a ripple in still water. The meal itself progressed with ceremonial slowness, wine poured with almost ritual care. One glass, left slightly tipped toward the edge of the table, caught the candlelight in a fleeting arc. A trivial detail, perhaps, but in its imperfection it seemed to mirror the undercurrent of imbalance among the assembled company. I reflected quietly on the nature of pride and secrecy, the way men guard their reputations and their disappointments with equal fervor, and how easily a single act of carelessness can reveal what is meant to remain hidden. Snatches of conversation reached my ears, fragments of Vance's personal life filtered through polite disinterest. A brief mention of a romantic entanglement, a fleeting argument over a trivial academic matter, the hint of jealousy in a senior fellow's tone were noted, catalogued, yet not acted upon. I allowed myself a slow sip of wine, the warmth a small comfort against the chill of unease that clung to the room. I found my attention drawn once again to the pattern of gestures, the careful arrangement of cutlery, the slight hesitation in a toast, the way one fellow's gaze wandered toward the library corridor. Minor, almost meaningless on their own, yet together forming a mosaic of tension that was as subtle as it was undeniable. Even the quiet scrape of a chair against the stone floor, the muted clink of porcelain seemed amplified, resonating with the latent unease that no words could fully capture. By the end of the meal, I left the hall with a sense of restrained observation, aware that beneath the formalities lay a lattice of ambition, envy, and unspoken concern. Vance's absence remained a shadow in every glance, in every inflection, and I knew that the threads I'd begun to trace among these men, delicate and intricate, would only tighten as the days unfolded, revealing truths hidden beneath the polished surface of All Souls College. It was late in the evening when the caretaker called me, a low voice carrying more curiosity than alarm. A faint light had been seen beneath the stairwell of All Souls, flickering intermittently, as though someone had attempted concealment rather than illumination. I arrived to find the stone steps damp from the persistent rain, the shadows deep and unyielding. The smell of wet stone mixed with the faint, acrid tang of burned wax, a combination that suggested a candle had been lit briefly and abandoned. I noticed the chair at the base of the stairwell, slightly off its usual position, scuffed along one leg. A minor detail, easily dismissed by anyone accustomed to the daily rhythms of the college, yet it drew my attention. There was a smudge of ink on the step, dark and irregular, almost as if a hand had brushed it in passing. The pattern of the smudge suggested haste, a fleeting presence that had left its mark only in the subtlest of ways. I crouched briefly, letting the soft echo of my movements carry across the quiet corridor, noting how the acoustics themselves hinted at a careful avoidance of observation. Near the top of the stairwell, a small notebook lay partially hidden beneath the banister. Its cover was worn, and the corners bent with frequent use. I recognized Vance's careful handwriting on the first page, neat and deliberate, yet interspersed with occasional annotations that betrayed the nervous haste of a mind both alert and preoccupied. The notebook seemed to contain early drafts of a paper, references to obscure poets, and marginalia that suggested a careful attempt at encoding meaning. A fleeting thought struck me. Sometimes what is hidden in plain sight carries the most significance. I observed a minor inconsistency in the page order, a sequence disrupted subtly, as though a particular thought had been removed or rearranged. The gesture was almost imperceptible but spoke of deliberate intent. I recalled the folded note from the library, its cryptic phrasing echoing faintly in my mind, and I began to see a pattern emerge, though still incomplete, still tantalizingly elusive. Even the placement of the notebook, half concealed yet accessible, suggested someone had hoped it might be found by the attentive, the patient observer. I let my gaze drift briefly to the corridor beyond, noting the small marks in the stone floor, the pattern of rain dripping through a nearby window, the faint shadow of a figure moving behind the glass of a distant doorway. Nothing was definitive, yet everything contributed to a growing sense of structure within the chaos. I made a mental note of the way the candlelight reflected in the small smudge of ink, as if drawing attention to the precise moment when a thought had been interrupted. Returning the notebook to a safer location, I allowed the details to settle in my mind. Each minor irregularity, each overlooked gesture, was a small thread in a larger tapestry I could not yet fully perceive. The quiet of the stairwell pressed in around me, punctuated only by the occasional drip of water from above, and I felt, with the familiar mixture of anticipation and unease, That this first clue so subtle, so easily disregarded, would guide the investigation in ways that were not yet apparent. In Oxford, as always, truth hides in the spaces between deliberate acts and inadvertent traces, waiting for the patient eye to discern it. The letters arrived by the ordinary channels of the college post, unremarkable except for the fact that I had been anticipating them. Each envelope bore the neat, precise handwriting of Edmund Vance, the ink slightly smudged at the corners, perhaps from haste or the damp air that had settled over the city. I opened them carefully, aware that even the smallest flourish, the tilt of a comma or a slight hesitation in phrasing, might carry significance. What struck me immediately was the recurrence of misquoted lines from obscure poets, phrases slightly altered as if to conceal intention or meaning. The subtle errors were almost imperceptible, but in a mind attuned to patterns, they hinted at preoccupations that were deliberate rather than accidental. One letter contained a passage in which Vance cited a line from Milton, though he had shifted the phrasing enough to suggest either forgetfulness or a cautious obfuscation. I read it twice, aloud softly to myself, noting the cadence, the punctuation, and the careful inversion of a couplet that altered the sense subtly. The change was minor, but telling it suggested a mind wrestling with ideas that could not be expressed openly, a hidden frustration perhaps, or a message intended only for those who would notice. I made a mental note of this, the way one might catalogue brush strokes in a painting for a later moment of recognition. The second letter arrived with an envelope slightly torn at the corner, the seal uneven, as though handled hurriedly. It contained references to a recent dispute over a manuscript, a mild rebuke to a fellow scholar whose judgment Vance found wanting. The words were courteous on the surface, yet I noticed a pause between sentences, a subtle hesitation that suggested veiled irritation. He spoke of principles, of integrity, of academic duty, but the phrasing carried an underlying tension. I observed the line spacing, the way certain words were underlined and recognized in these minor typographic choices, a map of emotional emphasis that could illuminate motive if interpreted carefully. In the corner of my mind, I recalled the minor anomaly in the library notebook, the marginalia that had seemed incidental at the time, and the folded note found among the classical poetry. Taken together, the letters and these earlier details suggested a narrative that moved through the intersection of pride, rivalry, and personal restraint. A subtle pattern was emerging, though still incomplete, requiring patience to discern the connections that were not spoken aloud, but merely hinted at in phrasing, spacing, and emphasis. I also noted the reaction of those who had seen the letters in passing. A fellow who glanced too long at a reference, another who adjusted his spectacles as if to reassess the contents. The gestures were almost imperceptible, and yet they added layers to the unfolding tension, tiny tremors that suggested more than the letters alone might reveal. Even the quiet scraping of a chair in the corridor seemed amplified in that tense, rain-muted silence, echoing the restrained agitation of the fellows. As I placed the letters aside, I reflected on the nature of communication in Oxford, how words, gestures, and even misquotes could serve simultaneously as explanation and concealment. The evidence remained delicate, fragile, yet significant. In this careful interplay of intention and oversight, I sensed that the truth was moving slowly toward me, waiting for the patient eye to discern the hidden lattice of meaning beneath the polite surface of these scholarly exchanges. The arrival of the visitor was noted with quiet ceremony, as though Oxford itself had paused to acknowledge the intrusion. He came from Cambridge, a scholar of no small reputation, and yet his presence carried an air of calculated purpose rather than congeniality. I met him in the Fellows' quadrangle, the rain glinting on the cobblestones, and noted immediately the precise way he held his umbrella, the slight stiffness in his posture, and the meticulous folding of a notebook under his arm. These gestures, minute and deliberate, spoke of a man accustomed to observation, to assessment, and to concealment. He greeted me cordially enough, his words carefully chosen, yet there was a rehearsed quality, the subtle modulation of tone that suggested both preparation and restraint. He spoke of Vance, of scholarly disputes, of the long-standing rivalry between certain fellows, framing it as recounting historical fact rather than immediate tension. Yet I detected the faintest inflection, the imperceptible hesitation that suggested a story tailored to shape perception rather than reveal it. We walked briefly along the cloistered arcades, the rain falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence, and I noted how he lingered slightly longer at each arch, eyes moving over the stonework with the precision of someone cataloguing detail. He mentioned a minor disagreement over a manuscript, his voice light, almost casual, yet I caught the shadow of tension beneath it. It was a story polished by intellect and habit, elegant in its delivery, but with cracks that only the observant might see. I paid particular attention to his hands, the way one finger traced an invisible line along the notebook's edge, a gesture too controlled to be unconscious. A fleeting gesture caught my attention. He adjusted his spectacles, then deliberately allowed them to settle just slightly off-center, a subtle imbalance that suggested an intentional deviation from composure. Small, almost imperceptible details such as this often reveal more than elaborate statements. It hinted at a desire to control, to distract, to direct interpretation, and in that, a faint sense of unease began to form in my mind. We passed the library windows, where the reflection of lamplight fractured across the rain-slicked stone, and he made mention of Vance's habit of cross-checking citations, of his insistence on precision. I noticed a slight tension in his jaw as he spoke, a micro-expression almost entirely suppressed that betrayed personal investment beyond the scholarly. Perhaps ambition, perhaps irritation, perhaps something subtler, a pride wounded by perceived oversight. I catalogued it quietly, as one does with a pattern that may later reveal itself. Before he departed, he spoke of a Cambridge lecture that had been interrupted, almost casually linking it to the broader narrative of rivalry and oversight. I observed the glance he cast over the quadrangle, a brief, deliberate sweep that lingered on the stairwell where Vance had last been noted. In that moment, I felt the faintest frisson of intuition, a sense that his story, elegant and plausible as it was, contained a fragment of truth entwined with a carefully concealed omission. As he left, the rain intensified, washing the stones with a rhythm that echoed in the empty corridors, and I found myself reflecting on the delicate interplay between observation and pretense. In Oxford, even the most courteous visitor can carry intentions masked beneath politeness, and I knew, without yet knowing precisely how, that this man from Cambridge would shift the frame of the inquiry, revealing tensions previously hidden and leaving behind a trace that only patience and quiet attention might follow. It was in the quiet of the library, the rain still drumming softly against the tall windows, that I found the photograph. Tucked into the pages of a worn volume on Renaissance literature, it depicted Vance with his former tutor, a figure of considerable influence and subtle menace. The edges were frayed, the image slightly faded, yet it carried an immediacy that seemed to defy its age. I traced the lines of their faces, the angle of the light, the slight distance between their shoulders, and felt that even in this frozen moment tensions lingered, hidden beneath polite smiles and formal posture. I held the photograph carefully, noting the way the younger Vance's hand rested on his companion's arm, a gesture of both respect and restraint, the tutor's expression fixed in the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to authority. Yet there was a subtle quiver in the corner of his mouth, the faintest hint of impatience or perhaps irritation, a detail easily overlooked, but for me, a minor insight into the dynamics of influence and control. Such nuances often carry the seed of motive if one knows where to look. Returning to the library table, I reopened the notebook found beneath the stairwell. The folded note discovered days earlier seemed now to resonate with the marginalia, the two forming a delicate dialogue across time and circumstance. A single line, underlined in both, appeared almost identical, though the contexts differed, an echo of concern, of caution, or of warning. It was the sort of detail one might dismiss, yet its repetition hinted at deliberate intention, a hidden thread running through Vance's interactions, both past and present. I observed the young scholar from Cambridge moving quietly among the stacks, carrying his bundle of papers with an air of meticulous attention. His eyes flicked, almost subconsciously, toward the photograph lying beside my notes. There was the briefest pause, a hesitation that betrayed more than his words ever would, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for reflex. Yet in my experience, such minor irregularities are often the first sparks of revelation. The library itself seemed to pulse with these hidden currents. The scent of old leather, the faint mildew of rain-damp stone, the rhythmic tapping of water against the glass, all conspired to sharpen the mind, to draw attention to what is otherwise imperceptible. I noticed the alignment of books along a shelf, slightly uneven where Vance had perhaps once retrieved them in thought or agitation, and a pencil, broken at the tip, lying precisely at the edge of a blank page. These trivialities, I reflected, often harbor truths obscured by the ordinary. I allowed the photograph to rest near the notebook, as if the two were in quiet conversation. Patterns emerged slowly, gestures repeated across time, phrasing mirrored in marginalia and letters, absences and presences mapped across walls and windows. The shadows of the past, captured in an image so innocuous, now seemed to extend into the present, casting their influence on decisions and movements that were otherwise unnoticed. Rising, I walked to the window, letting the rain-streaked glass blur the shapes of the cloister beyond. The city persisted outside in its ordinary rhythm, but within these walls, a lattice of ambition, rivalry, and subtle resentment stretched across time. The photograph, like the notes and notebooks, was a minor beacon, a fragmentary clue whose significance would only fully reveal itself when the mind traced carefully the delicate interplay of past and present. In Oxford, shadows never fall where one expects, and even the smallest image can cast a long, insistent presence. I returned to the stairwell late that evening, long after the usual bustle of the college had ebbed into muted shadows. The rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick and reflective, the lamplight fractured in the puddles like scattered thoughts. I had walked these steps before, noted the chair, the ink smudge, the abandoned notebook, yet something compelled me to revisit the scene with a sharper focus, as though the final clarity rested in a detail previously overlooked. I crouched near the base of the stairs, letting the stillness settle around me, and my gaze fell upon a fragment of paper half hidden beneath the scuff of the chair. It was almost invisible, a corner of parchment folded with care, bearing a single word in neat, deliberate handwriting. The word alone carried no immediate meaning, yet its placement, angled precisely under the chair's shadow, suggested intention. A minor, seemingly trivial act, but it flickered into significance once compared with the misquoted lines in the letters and the marginalia in the notebook. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp, and I noted the subtle impressions on the flagstones, the direction of the scuff marks, the way they curved just enough to indicate a hurried yet controlled movement. The sequence of these small physical traces suggested not accident, but the deliberate choreography of a mind seeking both concealment and revelation. I realized then that the fragment, so easily dismissed, was the hinge upon which the rest of the narrative might turn. I allowed myself a slow exhale, noticing for the first time the way the shadow of the banister fell across the floor, a subtle diagonal that intersected the fragment in an almost poetic geometry. It reminded me of a crossword clue, a small puzzle within the larger one, where a single letter transforms the meaning entirely. The parallel was not lost on me. The act of noticing, of discerning what others pass by, is often the first step toward understanding. I recalled the young scholar from Cambridge, the folded gestures, the slight pause over the photograph, and the hesitation in conversation. All these minor details, seemingly inconsequential on their own, now coalesced into a faint lattice of intent and attention. The fragment under the chair seemed to echo that hidden logic, a solitary beacon that invited the patient observer to connect it with other traces, other half-seen cues, and perhaps to glimpse a pattern beyond the superficial calm of the college. Rising, I traced the arc of the stairs with my eyes, considering the placement of each object, the residual marks of hands and feet, the faint smudges that hinted at nervousness or care. Even the act of bending to retrieve the fragment revealed something. The subtle way the edges caught in the lamplight, the slight hesitation in movement, the consciousness of being observed, whether by shadow or by memory. By the time I left the stairwell, the significance of the minor detail had settled in my mind. It was not dramatic, not declarative, yet it illuminated the rhythm of intention that underpinned the unfolding mystery. In Oxford, truth rarely arrives with trumpets. It whispers through the overlooked, the half-glimpsed, the nearly invisible. And it is there, in the quiet attention to such minor details, that understanding begins to take shape. I found myself once again in the Fellows' dining hall, the echoes of past meals lingering faintly in the polished wood and the quiet tilt of candlelight. The room was empty of students, the rain tapping against the high windows like a slow, insistent drum, and I stood before the senior fellows, aware that the culmination of days of observation, of marginalia, of small gestures, had brought me to this point. There was no triumph in the air, only a quiet insistence that attention, patience, and subtle deduction might uncover what politeness and routine had concealed. I began by recounting the sequence of events, almost as one might recall a narrative to oneself, emphasizing the small details, the misquoted lines in letters, the careful folding of notes, the fragment of paper beneath the stairwell chair. Each observation I offered was measured, deliberate, allowing the fellows to respond in kind, their expressions revealing just enough to illuminate hidden tensions. One senior fellow shifted subtly in his chair, a slight furrowing of the brow, a hesitation in breath, and I noted the alignment with a previously overlooked marginalia in the notebook. The confrontation proceeded without accusation, framed instead as recollection. I traced the faintly altered poetry, the repeated gestures, the deliberate placement of manuscripts. Each fellow's response was telling of a raised hand paused mid-motion, a gaze diverted, a cough carefully inserted to obscure the slight tremor of voice. Even in silence, the room communicated, each movement and stillness forming a lattice of hidden truths. I had long learned to watch not just what was said, but the manner in which it was carried, the almost imperceptible dissonance in routine behaviors. It was the young scholar, whose Cambridge visit had been politely noted, whose reaction was most revealing. A fleeting glance toward the stairwell, the subtle adjustment of spectacles, the brief tightening of a hand around a notebook, all indicated the burden of knowledge borne quietly, deliberately. I allowed these signals to unfold, observing as he struggled to reconcile presence and pretense, the tension of conscience expressed in minute, involuntary gestures. The revelation arrived in a minor, almost unremarkable sequence. A pause between words, a hesitation long enough to suggest recognition rather than fabrication, the echo of a pattern traced across days of subtle observation. Pride, rivalry, and unrequited ambition had intertwined, manifesting in gestures and phrases I had noted long before their significance crystallized. The culprit's acknowledgment, soft and reluctant, was framed not by confession, but by the quiet inevitability of recognition the moment when the meticulous lattice of evidence aligns with human truth. I allowed a silence to settle over the room, giving space for the confession to inhabit its proper weight. No dramatic flourish was necessary. The tension had been woven through small, deliberate acts, and now it resolved naturally, unforced. Even the shadows cast by candlelight seemed to shift, as though acknowledging the quiet illumination of intent and consequence. As I left the hall, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, the stones reflecting lamplight like scattered fragments of thought. I felt, as I often do in Oxford, that the resolution was never absolute, that understanding rests in observation as much as in declaration. The actions, gestures, and minor deviations, the overlooked fragments of daily life, had brought the hidden into focus. And yet, even as the truth stood revealed, the quiet ache of human pride and fragile ambition remained, lingering beneath the surface like a city that holds its secrets in shadows and stone. The rain had ceased entirely by the time I emerged from the quiet corridors of All Souls, leaving the stone walkways slick and luminous under the muted lamplight. I paused beneath one of the old lamps, the light spilling in a warm, circular pool onto the wet stones, and allowed myself the rare luxury of reflection. The case, such as it was, had unfolded with a precision both subtle and deliberate, guided not by force but by attention to the smallest irregularities. A fragment of paper, a misquoted line, the tilt of a chair. Oxford had whispered its secrets once more, and I had listened. I leaned lightly against the lamp-post, feeling the damp chill through my coat, and considered the fellows. Pride and ambition, tempered by intellect, had driven actions that were at once banal and profound. The young scholar from Cambridge, the senior fellows, the absent Vansiche had played a part in a drama that was quiet, deliberate, and human in its flaws. I thought of the gestures, almost imperceptible, that had carried truth before words had. A hand tightening around a notebook, a pause in speech, the careful placement of marginalia. These were the breadcrumbs that led to revelation, and they had been scattered across days like faint stars, guiding a patient observer. The photograph returned to mind, its frayed edges and faded faces recalling both innocence and tension. Vance and his tutor, captured in a moment that was outwardly mundane, had concealed the contours of rivalry and restraint beneath polite smiles. I reflected on the notes, the letters, the stairwell fragment, and the candle flickers in the corridors. Each detail, once trivial, had become a node in a network of meaning, an architecture of human intent. Even the lamplight itself seemed complicated, casting long shadows that stretched across the cobbles, intersecting with the reflections of puddles in patterns that echoed the lattice of events. It was a reminder that illumination is partial. That perception is always mediated by distance, angle, and the quality of observation. I felt the familiar melancholy of recognition, that understanding rarely comes without awareness of what remains unseen. A quiet thought returned, like a whispered note from a distant room. The minor detail, often overlooked, is the hinge upon which narrative turns. The fragment under the chair, the hesitations in speech, the misaligned punctuation all had contributed to the culmination of revelation. Yet none offered resolution in the emotional sense. The human cost of pride, ambition, and secrecy remained intact, lingering as subtly as the warmth of the lamp against the chill of night. I allowed my gaze to drift over the empty quadrangle, its arches etched in pale light, and considered how easily ordinary spaces conceal complex motives. Even the gentle murmur of the river beyond, muffled by distance and stone, seemed to echo the quiet tensions I had traced over these days. Oxford is patient, enduring, capable of holding both beauty and cruelty in delicate equilibrium. I took a slow step forward, leaving the pool of lamplight behind, and felt the night press gently against the shoulders of the city. The case, such as it had been, reached its quiet conclusion, yet its reverberations lingered, subtle and insistent. The lamp beneath which I had paused seemed now less an object than a witness, casting light on fragments, shadows, and the enduring mystery of human endeavor. In that quiet illumination, I realized that understanding, like the city itself, is never complete, and perhaps never meant to be. The quadrangle was silent when I returned that evening, the air heavy with the lingering scent of rain and old stone. Shadows stretched across the flagstones in fractured patterns, cast by lamps that burned with a dim persistence, as though reluctant to surrender their light to the night. I walked slowly, each step measured, listening to the subtle echo of my own movement, and felt the quiet weight of the days past settle around me. Oxford, in its enduring patience, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the stories woven into its stones to unfold fully, yet never entirely revealing them. I paused beneath an archway, noting the delicate interplay of lamplight and shadow across the cloister walls. The events of the past fortnight had left their mark not in clamour or declaration, but in the minutiae, a misquoted line of poetry, a fragment of paper under a stairwell chair, a hesitation in speech, a careful adjustment of spectacles. It was these subtleties, unnoticed by the unobservant, that had guided the discovery of truth, and I considered how easily they might be forgotten, swallowed by the ordinary rhythm of life in the college. Lewis joined me briefly, his expression reflective, the damp air settling into his coat. We spoke quietly, not of culpability or blame, but of the delicate balance between observation and inference, of the patience required to discern meaning in minor irregularities. He noted, as I had, the persistent way shadows seemed to stretch across the stones, a subtle metaphor for the lingering tensions, rivalries, and human frailties that had surfaced in the course of our inquiry. I allowed my gaze to wander to the empty windows of the fellows' rooms, faintly illuminated by lamplight, and thought of Vance, the absent figure whose quiet diligence had initiated a chain of minor clues, gestures, and fragments that had shaped the narrative. The photograph, the letters, the misaligned pages in a notebook all had contributed to the revelation without dramatic flourish, without confrontation beyond the gentle insistence of observation and deduction. I felt, as I often do in Oxford, that understanding is rarely loud or immediate. It resides in patience, attention, and a willingness to follow the faintest of traces. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving puddles that mirrored the lamplight like scattered fragments of thought. I noted, almost absent-mindedly, a minor ripple across one of these reflections, as though the city itself had shifted imperceptibly, acknowledging both resolution and continuity. In Oxford, the end of a story is rarely absolute. Conclusions are provisional, shaped by what is seen, what is remembered, and what remains hidden. I lingered in the quadrangle, tracing the outlines of shadows, observing the delicate interplay between illumination and darkness, and considered the human impulses that lie behind even the most measured actions. Pride, rivalry, hope, and restraint. The city, patient and indifferent, carries both the memory and the promise of events past, their significance preserved in gestures, fragments, and the quiet insistence of the attentive observer. As I turned to leave, the lamplight pooled one last time across the wet stone, highlighting both the contours of the quadrangle and the subtle echoes of human presence. I felt the familiar ache of melancholy that Oxford always inspires, the awareness that truth, though revealed in part, remains entwined with shadows, reflections, and the unspoken stories that persist in silence. The city endures, and so too do the secrets of those who pass beneath its lamps, leaving traces that only patience, observation, and quiet attention can discern.